privilege of introducing and chairing the session, the keynote session today, which is by Dr. Claire Lester from Mandela to Marikana Stumbling through Transformation in Defense of Academic Activism. We asked Claire for a bio, which I should read out now, but we had to coax into giving us a more extensive bio because obviously she's very humble. So I'm sure even with more prompting, we could have gotten more representative and true accounts. But anyway, Claire Lester is a lecturer in sociology in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, where she completed a PhD in 2020. Her PhD dissertation titled Legal Truth and Discourses of Violence in Post-Apartheid Commissions of Inquiry, the TRC and Marikana Commission, supervised by the McDonald, our chair, is an investigation of commissions of inquiry that have investigated violence in the mining sector, with key focus being the Marikana Commission and the TRC's institutional hearings on the mining sector, linking these into a genealogy of commissions in South Africa since the 1913 Witwatersrand Disturbances Commission. Using critical political economy approaches combined with discourse analysis, she argues that commissions of inquiry are primarily legal institutions and that their legal framings of violence influence their findings and the potential for both truth and justice for victims of state violence. In doing so, her work contributes to scholarship in the critical legal theory as she attempts to develop a critical legal sociology of commissions of inquiry, including truth commissions. To this end, she published a paper in Social Dynamics, the journal, The Role of Law in Commissions of Inquiry Towards a Materialist Approach in 2019. The dissertation is currently in the final 5 of the African Studies Review, Best African-Based Dissertation Award, awaiting final placement. But her interests are broad, and she publishes on issues related to South African and global South politics and society, like a co-authored publication titled The Contradictions of Black Consciousness from Ego to Rose's Fall. She writes for public media such as the article titled The Rapid Reopening of the Economy Does Not Empower Women, the Daily Maverick, and Who Will Watch the Watchmen, the first critiquing the state's provision of social support and rushing a return to work without necessarily social protections, and the latter on police violence, both published during the COVID lockdown. Last month, she wrote for an edited series on Marikana for the online publication Africa is a Country. She did an MPhil in Justice and Transformation at UCT, and an interdisciplinary program in the Political Studies and Public Law. She is a recipient of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, SSRC Proposal Development Grant, NRF Scarce Skills Scholarship, and the NIHSS PhD Scholarship. She was also awarded the Fulbright Visiting Researcher Fellowship in 2019, the only South African to receive that award in that year. However, she could not do it due to COVID. Without further ado.
Great, and it's quite strange to be doing a keynote because really just a few years ago I was also presenting parts of my PhD, which is now complete. So it really is a wonderful opportunity that the department gives for us to present our work. So thank you for inviting me, Dennis, to give this keynote, although the genre is something that I have never done before and I have to do a bit of research into what a keynote ought to entail, so I hope that I do it justice. As Matthew said, the title is From Mandela to Marikana, Stumbling Through Transformation in Defense of Academic Activism. And so because it's a keynote, it's not strictly an academic paper. I'm not really presenting my research per se, but I thought because I am speaking to a graduate audience of students that I would address my talk to you, and because you're studying such various and fascinating things, that I would make my approach more broad. And so I'll frame it around my research journey, and I'm still on, but also that all of you are still on. So firstly, it's important to begin perhaps where I'm going to end, which is with Marikana. So this month, August 2022, marks 10 years since what is by some known as the Marikana massacre, and others, predominantly state actors or capitalist corporations, the Marikana tragedy. So while many of the students in this room might not remember this or may not know what it is or might not really care, it is this notorious event in 2012 when the South African police force shot mine workers who were striking at Lonmin Platinum Mine for a wage increase. 34 were killed and another 70 plus were wounded in the ordeal. And this was captured on live television. So I remember very clearly when this happened. It came following the killing of another 10 people on the mine in the preceding days as a result of rising tension on the mine, but in the platinum sector more generally, the 6 mine workers, 2 Lonmin private security guards, and 2 members of the South African police force. And what made this event even more shocking was that the event was, like I said, filmed, and it was broadcast to television screens, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. The South African police force acting under the auspices of the ANC, the National Liberation government, shooting down workers who had probably voted for them since 1994. So by 2012, the narrative of the peaceful transition and miraculous Rainbow Nation was no stranger to critique, particularly considering the ANC's failure to address structural inequality. But Marikana really shattered whatever hopeful vision of the present that remained and really brought into sharp focus the contradictions of this transition to democracy in the context of while embracing economic policies that were primarily pro-business and using these as a conduit for economic development in New South Africa. So most of my postgraduate dissertation work has been related in some way to this event, and this is why I use the Marikana massacre and sort of ideas surrounding it as a vantage point from which to reflect on key moments in South Africa's social and political landscape, but linking these to my personal and academic journey, showing that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey and also a personal journey, and that I'm very much still on as you are too. So like I said, when this happened, I was in my honors year, effectively at the very beginning of my postgraduate career, where many of you now are. And I was registered in this program called Justice and Transformation. And this was, as Matthew said, an interdisciplinary program focused, an interdisciplinary honors stream in the UCT politics department. And I just completed my first semester's core courses, which was called Comparative Transitional Justice, and we'd spent an intensive 6 months focusing on transitions globally and historically in the various ways that states and communities have responded to periods of violence or authoritarian rule and theorizing different types of transitions to democracy. So we've been unpacking these questions related to judicial and ethical responses to periods of violence or conflict, as well as the institutional responses to these. And so naturally, a focus was the South African transition and the TRC, or the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first Truth Commission was the Argentina's National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons in 1983. And so I just want to elaborate a bit more on Truth Commissions because they are relevant to understanding the post-apartheid dispensation, but as I'll show also to my research on Marikana. So Truth Commissions are established in societies that are undergoing some period of after a period of civil war or protracted violence or authoritarianism and are transitioning to some form of democratic rule. As such, they are a form of transitional justice tool. Now, transitional justice itself is a theoretical and practical field that centers on the theory and practices of strategies for how incumbent democratic regimes ought to basically deal with conflicts of the past. Primarily, the focus of such strategies is to gain some measure of justice for victims of gross human rights violations, to apportion either legal, moral responsibility or criminal liability for past crimes, to establish a renewed culture of transparency and respect for the rule of law as part of some major political transformation. So in general, this involves judicial and non-judicial approaches, including prosecuting perpetrators for past crimes, seen after the Nuremberg trials after World War II, or indeed the work of the International Criminal Court, looking at the conflict in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, establishing truth commissions or other forms of investigatory practices like historical commissions or more community-based interventions like the Dashasa courts in Rwanda, or fostering reconciliation efforts in deeply divided societies where there's been ethnic cleansing, those types of things, or facilitating commemoration and acknowledgement for programs for people who have been most affected by violence and tyranny, as well as reforming state institutions like the state security forces, the police, and the military. So all of these things you will see are relevant in some way to South Africa's transition, but also beyond that. So truth commissions have then been engaged in terms of their capacity to improve human rights, their ability to privilege reconciliation and healing over retributive justice, or kind of the eye for an eye approach to justice, although the extent to which they do this depends on, obviously, on the context and the scholar who's doing the work. But what's common about these processes is what motivates them, and this is which is that the crimes of the past will never happen again. And so that's why the name of the very first truth commission in Argentina was called Nunca Más, which means never again in Spanish. But with Marikana, if we go back to what I just said, it was clear that we were seeing again something which we were told, or that I was told, was a kind of state violence that in South Africa belongs to a bygone colonial and apartheid history. But how had we gotten here? As Kylie Thomas asserts, the Marikana massacre can be understood as marking the end of the first period of the South African transition, an ideal of the newly democratic rainbow nation. So how had we gotten from Mandela to Marikana? In many ways, my research journey since then has been informed by this very question and an attempt to understand the various intersecting moments, decisions, forces, and conditions that allowed Marikana to take place. But I also understand my desire to apprehend this moment not only as academic curiosity, but one that is profoundly personal. So like I said, I don't know if I did say it. Anyway, I was born in 1989, South Africa. And at the time, my parents were living in a Dorpy, then so-called coloured township called Bella Vista in Ceres, where my father was stationed as an Anglican priest. So he recounted. Oh, there, sorry. I missed it. I was born in 1989 and grew up on the cusp of South Africa's transition. And on my 21st birthday, and perhaps some of you are about to engage or have undergone this inane rite of passage in South Africa, but my father decided to, my great horror, to tell my friends gathered about when I was born. So, like I said, I was born in 89, and my parents were living in this town called Bella Vista in Ceres, where my father was stationed as an Anglican priest. So he's telling the story to my friends in our horror about my mother's labor pains growing more intense, and then deciding, okay, it's time to go to the hospital. So they got into the car and they're driving, and he's being very, very dramatic, and they're driving in the dark of the night to Ceres Hospital, and then as they're approaching the hospital, he turns to my mother and says, must I go to the front or to the back? So this, of course, was relating to the fact that there were, at the time, still separate entrances at the hospital for people of different races. So if you've ever seen a woman in labor or have been in labor yourself, it's not a time to be asked to make any decisions. But in any case, I was born at the back of the still segregated hospital so that my father could be present at my birth. And 2 months later, the world would see the end of another major segregation with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989, dividing the communist East from West Germany. And it marked the beginning of the lifting of the called Iron Curtain, the political, military, and ideological boundary dividing the Eastern and Central European allies from the Soviet Union and the non-communist Western states. So it was effectively the beginning of the end of the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union had been instrumental in supporting decolonization and liberation movements in Africa, including the South African African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. Not long after, anti-apartheid organizations were unbanned, including the ANC, SACP, and the PAC. So born at this moment of immense global and social change, perhaps like Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, born on the eve of independence and partition, something became hardwired into me. But this was the strong impetus to try and make sense of the world, this changing world that I found myself in, and how to understand the tensions, contradictions, segregations, and efforts of transformation across time and space. So mine was one of the first school cohorts of its kind. I went to preschool in 1994 when children, for the first time of different skin colors, could play together on the swings. And I began my school days with the same kind of expectations, I think, as any new schoolgoer, with a lot of expectance and excitement. But I also began my school days as an unknowing pilgrim, a mascot for New South Africa whose future remained unknown. But amidst the new flag and the multitude of television and supermarket campaigns branding the moment as this new South Africa and a rainbow nation, a dirty war had been waging in the townships, the IFP and the ANC, between the IFP and ANC, fueled again by a third force of the apartheid state security agencies. The country was essentially on the brink of civil war, and with more than 20,000 people killed before 1985 and 1995. And I would learn much later on that this was the context in which the new South Africa was really born. And upon reflection, the new South Africa that I was shielded from based on my social and economic position. But in those formative years, my family and I were moving in between Cape Town's previously segregated racial zones to where my father was deployed as a priest. So from Ceres to Mitchell's Plain to Hoffman Village, Athlone, and then finally Mowbray, where I lived for the duration of my school days. So being mixed race, my siblings and I laid bare the ludicrousness of apartheid's racial order that governed populations, bodies, intimacy, and that essentialized racial difference that allegedly ran from one's fingertips to their innermost thoughts, their culture, their worldview, their episteme. This was, after all, the rationale for apartheid's notion of separate but equal, to allow each race to pursue its own cultural determinations. Democracy was, after all, not part of African culture, apartheid supporters would argue. But at the same time, in the post-apartheid era, my engagements with the social world reflected how ossified and internalized apartheid's racial categories were, even in the minds of young children with no active memory of apartheid or apartheid social conditioning. Despite the constitutional vision of a non-racial society, it was clear that elements of racecraft remained, to use the term from Khan and Ronald Fields. Maybe it was because non-racialism as a policy was never really tried by the ANC, preferred instead a multiracial perspective. After all, the Rainbow Nation metaphor upon which the new South Africa was discursively constructed was comprised of distinct colors, distinct races. So in 1996, the year of the adoption of South Africa's current constitution, I began grade 1. This was also the year that the TRC started to be aired on national television. Between April 96 and March 98, 87 episodes were aired, covering the first 2 of 5 years of the Truth Commission's work. This is where the Commission travelled all over the country collecting testimonies about people's experiences of gross human rights violations by the apartheid state. The weekly episodes were called the Special Report, produced and presented by Max de Prier, an investigative journalist who had started a paper called the Vrije Weekblad, and who had in the early 1990s, together with some other journalists, exposed some of the covert state crimes of death camps like Vlakplaas. And at around the same time, stories had emerged about the ANC's own violent disciplinary tactics used in its exile training camps in Angola, places like Angola and Tanzania. Because of this coming out, it's actually neither the NP nor the ANC actually wanted a truth commission. In fact, both sides vehemently opposed it. Instead, they rather wanted to sweep these stories under the rug and just kind of have the amnesiac approach to transitional justice. And in fact, the interim constitution made no mention of the term truth or the need for truth at all. The only thing that was in the interim constitution was that there should be amnesty. Amnesty was actually a prerequisite of the negotiated transition. Amnesty meaning no prosecutions for past crimes. So it was actually the work of civil society groups, particular NGOs and actors who pushed for this Truth Commission. And as shown in the image here, it began to work in '96. I'd like to get a show of hands of anyone who's ever watched any footage from the TRC. Okay. So not half, right? So it actually turns out that all of the episodes are now available on YouTube. It hasn't always been the case, but they are now. I'm not sure when they exactly went up, but there are very few people who have watched them, which is a cool research project. If anyone thinking about doing a project on those as media sources, they're really fascinating. But my point of bringing those up is the fact that what was to illuminate what was happening in the country as I was growing up and as I was becoming more aware of my own surroundings, and I was literally learning how to read and write. So for 5 years, pretty much my entire junior school period, there was in action this national reckoning with the past and this public engagement with notions of truth, justice, and terms like factual truth, personal truth, as well as the pressing question of justice. People questioning, maybe we can do that, but yeah, there's a pair of cartoon obviously saying that Eugene de Kock. So Eugene de Kock was one of the people who led Vlakplaas, the sort of death camp as the and you have Tutu asking, can you list your crimes that you'll be applying for amnesty, and he's got a very, very long list. So people were really questioning what was going to happen. Should people really be getting amnesty for these horrendous crimes? Was this just and ethical, etc.? These things were on TV. It was being discussed on the news and on the radio. People were really asking about, were these people going to get away with what they'd done? What was going to happen to those families who'd been forcibly removed from their communities and their homes? Something which I also learned happened to my own father and his family when they were forcibly removed from Constantia in 1965, and the reason why my grandparents still lived in Boston Park. So in many ways, these are the kind of questions and experiences that drove me to study, my decision to study the humanities and to devour everything that I could to try and understand what was happening in the world. So I did my BA with a triple major in politics, English, and history, with electives in philosophy, because what is a BA without a little sprinkling of existentialism? But it was not long before I became most interested in how these disciplines actually related to one another and how the analytical tools concerning discourse, power, and language that I was learning in my English classes, reading Sociology, Austin, and Sociology, and Mandela, provided richness to my understanding of political institutions and of identity and sense-making. how the history course that I did on the roots of anti-Semitism would, for example, shape and inform my thinking about the social construction of race that is materially and historically contingent. The more I learned, the more aware I was that my life was dependent on history, on social history, and on those people who had come before me. But in 2008, the year I began my undergraduate degree, was also the year of what economic historian Adam Tooze described as the greatest economic crisis, not since the Great Depression, but in history. I don't even want to ask how old when that happened. Big deal. But at no point in history had so many financial institutions been in jeopardy at the same time. All of a sudden, the keywords that had dominated common parlance, reconciliation, democracy, and so forth, were replaced by words like crisis, neoliberalism, corporate greed, and now written about in mainstream media and not only by the hippies who are playing hacky sack outside the UCT arts block. So the instability of the capitalist world order was laid bare. The promises of the Washington Consensus, neoliberal triumphalism, and financial globalization had not been realized. Since then, South Africa has never fully returned to its levels of pre-90, its economic growth levels of pre-2007 to 2008. And the crisis is reported to have led to about 1 million job losses in South Africa. It's really difficult to explain the impact that it had on me at this moment, going to university for the first time, filled with narratives of Western triumphs over evil Russian communists. One of our matric essays in history was Stalin's 5-year plans, and we learned about the Gulag. And the images in my mind were very kind of set. And then kind of realizing what you believed about the world and about the economy, about the institutions like the World Bank and the UN and so forth, as linked to freedom and democracy, were not what you thought that they were, or what you believed them to be. And it led me to think more deeply and critically about how I understood the transition in South Africa and the global capitalist system, how I understood apartheid not only as a system of racial discrimination, one of racial capitalism and of super exploitation. And so writing for me then, and learning itself, just learning, became a form of activism for me. And in many ways it still is, through learning and unlearning lies or untruths, whatever you want to call them, myths. So now I'll return to the Marikana massacre. The Marikana massacre was another moment where these myths, or what I've come to believe about the post-apartheid state and dispensation, me as a born free, was truly shattered. Shortly following the massacre, another astounding thing happened. The surviving 259 mine workers who had been on strike were charged with murder of their 34 colleagues by the National Prosecuting Authority and arrested under the doctrine of common purpose. Public statements then by political figures justified the violence, saying the mine workers had been protesting illegally, that they had broken many laws like the Labour Relations Act for their wildcat strike, as well as the Dangerous Weapons Act. Common purpose had been used together with the Righteous Assemblies Act of 1956, which has actually never been revoked in Parliament. It remains in the statute books in the dying days of apartheid, as the state faced growing internal and external pressure for reform. The law was leveraged primarily to criminalize opponents of the regime. And Section 18 of this act states that any person who conspires with any other person to aid in the commission of a crime or incite or instigates any other person to commit a crime is guilty of a crime. The provision was used to secure criminal conviction against people involved in protest marches or against leaders of political movements like the ANC or the UDF, whose members, on the instruction of leaders, of a leader or leaders, had taken part in sabotage activities or the assault or killing of representatives of the apartheid state. So, after the transition, the TRC, the AMOD, the Hamas, we were seeing really a repetition of an apartheid application of an apartheid law in South Africa. The National Prosecuting Authority had, in this case, flagrantly abused the law and misapplied it. And it became clear that it was actually part of a smear campaign to present the striking mine workers as criminals. And it did work, although the charges were subsequently dropped. This also only entrenched my growing suspicion of official discourses, particularly those that were surrounding the topic of state violence. As more information emerged in the media, it became clear that at the then Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, Tumalina, our current president, was also a majority shareholder and director at the mine where the massacre had taken place, and that he'd been involved in liaising between the London Private Security, the directors, the South African Police Service, and the Minister of Mineral Resources, Susan Kebano. And it exposed explicitly and rather crudely the insidious relationship between the state and capital that Marx and Engels write about in the Communist Manifesto, that the state is a committee for managing the affairs of the capitalist class. And then about a week later, the president then, Jacob Zuma, established this commission of inquiry to investigate generally the causes of this so-called tragedy. Not long after that, it began its work with its main motto being truth, restoration, and justice. So this motto, which in the context of Marikana I found particularly disturbing, has really been the impetus of my research work since 2012, engaging with these concepts in their various iterations and as they relate to various areas of social life. I really wanted to know what was going on here. Why was this regular judicial commission leveraging TRC discourse to respond to this moment so many years after the transition? And what were the potentials for this commission to really establish truth, restoration, and justice? And so this led into my PhD research, analyzing Marikana, but also the history of mining labor struggles related to wages. And for me, the TRC had to be included in this history. I found that the TRC dedicated one day to the topic of the mining sector's role in apartheid. And this was not even in the perpetrator hearings, this was in the institutional hearings of business. So I've been tracing continuities and shift in the apartheid and post-apartheid period in the way that questions of truth and justice have been approached in relation to past political violence. And I present Marikana as exemplifying an enduring problem in the post-apartheid dispensation, which is to keep the major facets of economic organization and ownership intact, reproducing forms of violence, be that structural or physical, as well as social inequity in the South African mining sector. Both of these post-apartheid truth-seeking commissions were historicized as part of a longer history of official commissions established throughout British imperialism, colonialism in other colonies. So I deal with from in Jamaica and in Trinidad, as well as the 1913 Witwatersrand Disturbances Commission in South Africa to investigate excesses in violence by state security when quelling some major uprising in the mining sector, and tracing how this institutional form has continued through the transition and into the post-apartheid democratic era. And what became clear to me that although these commissions were really so different over many years and occurring at different periods, at a basic level, these commissions were really concerned with the law or discourses of the law, that they were used in attempts to bring society more in line with the law, to discover new laws or impose colonial laws and assert indigenous custom and so forth. But particularly, they've been used in situations where the traditional institutions of law, like the courts and the police, have either lost their legitimacy or been stretched to capacity, being severely undermined. So, like I said, I was born into a society where the law was used to suppress the majority and to legitimate an illegitimate social order. And as Marikana showed, we were really still seeing how the law was being deployed to discipline, to suppress worker protests, and to protect powerful And so these observations will drive my current research and what I'm trying to do in terms of developing a sort of contributing to a critical legal sociology of commissions of inquiry, but also to revive critical legal sociology more generally, because I found that there isn't really much on it, especially in contemporary. And so the point of my personal reflections today here was really to provide an unfolding of history from Mandela to Marikana, and to share with you some of my own research journey, placing it in this unfolding of the post-apartheid period. And I also wanted to, in a world of post-truth and deep fakes, defend the idea that a commitment to truth and knowledge is in itself a form of activism. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Claire. So I'm going to open up for questions. We have about 25 minutes. And as Claire was saying throughout her talk, I think it's very important for students to engage with questions as well. So please do feel welcome to ask questions. So should we want to do round of 3?
That's fine, yeah. And I didn't speak so much about my research, but if you want to ask questions about my research or any sort of other period that I generally touched on, you also can do that.
The initial hands.
Okay. I don't know if this is a question or maybe it's a comment. I feel like South Africans are tired of commissions because nothing serious really comes out of these commissions. There's so much promise, so many promises, but when you look at the deliveries, I mean, you asked the question, how many of us have seen the TRC? All I can still remember now, I can't remember how old I was when this thing happened. I could see Desmond Tutu wearing his Fundesi robe, and a white person sitting with a microphone and a translator, and a black woman crying, like literally crying. That is all I can remember about the TRC. But in terms of what has happened, you look at Credoc, comrades are still crying, they're still asking questions. What happened? What happened to the Credoc form? Yeah, they're still asking those questions even today. I mean, the Marikana. I mean, we spoke, and for me, I feel like there's one narrative that is missing, which I think holds like a clue to what we want to really to achieve with Marikana, and that is the labor's narrative. I think somehow trade unions have been so opportunistic in terms of getting into this legalistic argument about you, Ramaphosa, in the state, the police, but they have never really sat down and reflected on how this grand constitution, this beautiful legislation that we've designed post-1994, how it failed them. And as labor, how are they reflecting on the limits of the transition and how it's impacting on the collective bargaining process? How we got to this moment. So this is where I am. What I'm saying is I'm tired, like many South Africans, commissions. But thank you so much for packaging it so nicely.
Cheryl.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you for that. I mean, there is a tradition of public sociology and anthropology in this country. So I'm interested in terms of your academic activism and reflections on your own academic career. You spoke briefly about your undergraduate coursework, etc. But now that you're teaching in the sociology department, you're thinking about the curriculum. And one of the things I have felt is the importance of history as an area of inquiry, and obviously there's historiographical struggles, etc. And you reference history and its importance. But, how does one, both undergraduate but also the postgraduate level, when one's working within a more narrowly defined discipline and field, what should the curriculum be? And I mean, there's a large question, but just some thoughts on that nurtures that kind of academic activism, public intellectual that you're practicing, but also aspiring to.
I really enjoyed your personal narrative. So if I could just get it, because as you were talking, I also know your work, which tries to look at the importance of law. And by the time you ended, my answer was, it doesn't really matter. Law is, and my thoughts went back to when you were born, 1989, because I think we underestimate 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, because what I think happened there is that de Klerk was actually wiser than all of us. De Klerk realized that law doesn't really matter. Whatever's going to be established in our constitution and our laws is not going to be fundamental. That the capitalist global revolution since the 1970s that culminated in the fall of the wall in 89, and the balance of forces was going to make it impossible to really radically structure internally the South African economy. He took a chance, but I think he read the situation correctly. And we need to go back to when you were born in 89 and recognize that radical transformation de Klerk was right. It was not possible because of the global balance of forces. Whatever you do with the law and the commissions of inquiry, it was not possible to have a radical transformation. He realized that. That's why he unbanned the ANC and the SAC. And I think we should stop blaming what's going on in South Africa. Things have gone wrong here, but we should wake up to the balance of global forces, which are the main problem.
I suppose, and then we'll do another round.
Yeah, I mean, not all more questions, but so this frustration with commissions is also what drove why I wanted to study the Marikana Commission. And so the data that I use in my research is actually the commissions themselves. And so, if no other purpose, utility of these commissions is that they really do gather these archives of information on a topic that then can be used by particular social forces, to use Dave's term. And much of this, I do believe, that depends on the balance of social forces. And commissions will only, one of my chapters of the PhD is actually making this argument that the power of a commission is an empty shell. Although it is in many ways constrained by the legal framework that constitutes it, the laws and regulation that it's born by, but also the balance of social forces. So in particular instances, you can make particular assessments of a particular commission. And I would say in terms of many of them done with TRC, but with the Marikana Commission, one of the benefits of it was the ability to kind of subpoena Lonman's financial documents, for example, where Lonman basically could show where it said, oh, we couldn't afford to pay people what they wanted, the living wage, or we couldn't afford to build the houses that we had promised to build, so as part of our social labor plan, which was the contract upon which it got its mining licenses, and someone was presenting also on kind of corporate social responsibility and those kinds of things. Social plans in exchange for mining rights and things like that, which it didn't do. And so the commission actually subpoenaed those documents and was able to prove that Lonman had been paying its shareholders wonderful dividends over the years, that money was being siphoned off to the Bermuda and whatever. So there, the commission did find that Lonman did contribute to the creation of tension and unrest, and however it was worded in the terms of reference. But then again, what happens after that? No one is really prosecuted, no one is really found guilty or anything like that. What I would say is really useful is that all the information still there and can be used to advance particular struggles. So now even this idea that the Commission's assessment of the toxic collusion between Ramaphosa and London and things like that, they said there wasn't any. But just 2 weeks ago, the surviving mine workers were back in court, and Judge Prince found that there was potential that Ramaphosa could be held personally liable because of the fact that he was in this collusive position. So I mean, it's 10 years later, but these things kind of live on in public consciousness and in obviously actions of people. Even the TRC I saw just in the wake of the student protests and Peace Must Fall and things started a fund where those who had been identified as victims of gross human rights violations by the TRC or their sort of descendants, children, and so forth, could apply for funding for the university and things. So there are ways in which it's sort of not dead, but it's, yeah, maybe in terms of actually having an effect, I think it just depends on civil society to push them. And then in terms of the activism, yeah, I mean, I'm personally involved in quite a bit of activism at university, part of the education society, Shawcode, Stellenbosch, and Boys Must Fall, and Peace Must Fall, and things like that. I think that a problem in universities generally is this kind of divorce of academia from like the general struggles. It was really only in one class, taught by a particular person undergrad, that I even learned concepts like capitalism or kind of the tools to analyze the world, and that's not, I'm sure, only my experience. It was sort of something I had to like teach myself. Hopefully people aren't getting that. We're taught by Bernard, so that's not the case. But I suppose it's just, for me, I mean, I can't advise, obviously, an entire curriculum, but I do think equipping people with the tools to understand their world is probably an essential thing. Because when it's not done, then it does feel kind of sinister, almost. When you have students who are graduating with an economics degree who actually don't know what capitalism is, because their understanding it isn't a sort of historically contingent system, but just the economy or the market. But obviously the market system is different to a capitalist system. Well, not so obviously, actually, but so I think, if anything, that should be the goal of a curriculum in social sciences for anyone. Even in medicine, for example, things are taught very technically. So you have someone who can do a heart transplant but doesn't know anything else about the world. I guess that's a task. Dave, let's go back to 1989. Yeah, I think your point, your comment is valuable, and again, something that, reflecting on this presentation, I did think more about, because in my sort of consciousness, it was very much like 1994 is when things sort of began, and that's kind of when things matter. We don't really have to worry about anything before then, but it is only through reading and learning and seeing, hey, that things were more connected than, it wasn't just like the ANC. People finally realized, yes, let's give rights to the people out of the goodness of our hearts. That there were obviously like broader, global things in terms of the balance of power going on there. So I think that kind of economic history does need to be done.
Shahid, do we have a third?
Thanks so much, Claire. I have kind of like 2 points. The one was just to point out that, as much as shock is an interesting trope to get a point across, it's also highly subjective, right? And the 2000s was a time of global neoliberal prosperity. So the middle class all over the world, I mean, I know that there were white and Indian middle class who had moved abroad, they were all coming back to South Africa. I was personally doing a CA at the time, right? So I was a CA working in the middle of a capitalist, and I could see that we were basically creating inequality and the whole world of this country was up. Right? So I think it's very important to remember that shock is highly subjective, right? And there was prosperity, but it was highly limited. You know what happened with gear, right? It completely, all this kind of stuff, all the neoliberal policies are designed to create inequality. So the question is then around this kind of question of like mind violence. Now, I'm not an expert at this, but I understand that whenever there's protest at mine, somebody gets shot. The violence against mine workers in South Africa doesn't just stop in '94. And so then we need a different kind of social history for this. What is it about Ramaphosa being a big shareholder? Was he the majority shareholder, you say? Okay, so majority shareholder, right? So, and then what about the fact that you've got challenges coming at the ANC from within the ANC, right? So because of what we know now about the way that in most of the post-colonial world, politics, violence is a part, and Ruchi Chakrabarti has some brilliant work on that, you can read the stuff. So there's something going on about whether, is this really a turning point, or is it a turning point in South African politics? So I totally agree with you, we were all shocked, like shit, this thing happened again. But then when you looked outside, you were like, no, but people getting shot here and this, everything. So there's something about maybe one can have a reading of mind violence and the continuity of that, and the nature of the dispensability of life in this kind of extractive economies, right? Which goes much further back, and I think David suggested doesn't necessarily warrant this radical kind of rupture argument. But so that's the one question. The other question is, I don't know, you probably know. The other question is about the commission. Here, I think I want to contest you on this. You say that commissions are used where the law has been used for violent ends. From what I understand, commissions are used when the law is unwilling actually to do anything, right? Because the law as a particular kind of institution is always very close to state power, right? Like you suggested with Engels, and many people have written about that. So the commission has a very particular tool, and it's interesting because it's about truth and healing, right? So what is this concept of truth that you are appealing to and that they are appealing to? Healing. This is an incredibly Christian kind of idea, right? What is the thing actually doing, and where is materiality in this whole question? And would that actually change? Because what I hear, in a way, in your talk, is that you are quite supportive of the TRC, but quite cynical of Marikana. And in the middle of all this is a third point, which is a minor point. 1998, Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a philosophical critique of the TRC. It is convincing. It has not been refuted by anybody. It has actually been dismissed. 2002, he publishes it as an academic article. And there's something about the South African left and the South African academy that is scared of deep archival theoretical reflection on the nature of the transition. So my third question to you is, Danny said this, and you know what the politics of him was. He wanted to change the archive in South Africa, he wanted to change the curriculum, and they didn't want him. And this is a significant figure, right? Columbia University setting up a website. So I wonder if we can break your narrative a little bit. Mind violence as a feature of South African economic life, Mamdani and people like this making theoretical interventions which have been ignored and completely dismissed, and then this unequal kind of prosperity which you produce. And I'm a beneficiary of that. Right? We all are. This is not a tricky question like, oh, it's only white people. No. All middle class people in South Africa benefit from it, but they just happen to be white and Indian.
You want to take the?
No, I think I'll respond to Shahid. I suppose it's always the problem of doing a condensed a lot into a short talk. So my engagement with the TRC, especially in my thesis, is actually more critical. And in fact, the chapter begins with Mamdani's critique of the TRC, which was that the TRC individualized victims, that it didn't talk that apartheid was primarily a regime that targeted communities and not individuals, and so reparations should be community reparations and so forth. So my reading is actually, I critique Mamdani, but by actually reading the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which is that actually, if you read the act, it actually does make room for community reparations in the way that it defines a victim. So my critique then was why, by its own reading of the legislation that underpinned it, did it not do that? And so my response then was to look at its the legal approach. Even though the TRC tried to set itself aside from a legal commission by having, the guy Tutu in his bishop's outfit and not making it court-like and things like that, making it more distasteful feeling, trying to express this kind of Christian vibe onto it. My argument was that it actually was more legal than what it tried to make itself out to be in its focus on these internationally defined gross human rights violations. And so my critique there was more of a kind of critique of international law. And I mean, the word exploitation is not even in the dictionary of the ILO. And so trying to critique that a legal framework constrains the purview of what a commission can even report on from the outset. And so even though it will, in these institutional hearings on business, get all of this information from various labor movements, from the various mining protests and violence, the fact that in 1913 and in 87 and in 88 and in there were all these mining sector and uprisings and brutal state suppression. Still, the TRC didn't consider that the mining sector was even in the category of perpetrators. And so my reading was kind of bringing in an ideology of legal ideology, sort of constraining the findings that the commission made. So it wasn't simply praising the Truth Commission or the Marikana Commission, but it was actually about this history of what least obviously I couldn't do in a PhD, but this introduction is looking at, look, this isn't something new, this is something that has been happening in South Africa, and how can we understand it within this continuum instead of what I was told was a break, like critiquing that sort of rupture element. But yeah, that's not allowing me to elaborate on my research. I can't remember who else asked.
I'm just, no, you're waiting for questions. So I think we'll just do 3 more. So it's Bernard, Tumi, and then Stephen. Just in the interest of time, Claire's a lecturer here, so we all have access to it.
I'll be quick. I want to, for the second time today, I mean, he announced our disagreement earlier. I'm going to announce our disagreement now. I disagree with Dave Cooper. I think that what's interesting is precisely the ways in which, even if the law is limited, that sometimes in these documents you find evidence that can be picked up later. You can find facts that can be picked up later. Even if the law kind of conspires to keep state power intact, sometimes despite its mechanics and legalese, you can find other things there. And I think, so I think that, as social analysts, it's often in these, ethnographers or whatever, in unpredictable places, despite structural forces, that one finds interesting things that appear. And then the second thing, I think,
Yeah, I agree with Bernard.
And then the second thing is, I think it's really interesting the ways in which the ANC and the National Party, neither of them supported the TRC, right? And yet, civil society pressure gave rise to it. So the implication then, to pick up the question about academic activism and also back to Cheryl, is, what are the ways in the contemporary moment that, forms of scholarship, forms of teaching, forms of engagement, inside and outside the academy can produce civil society pressure to not necessarily have another commission, because we can see that they're limited, although they do tell us things anyway, but to produce social change. So that's what I think your talk inspired me to think through those possibilities. That's not just kind of the collusion of the powerful that produces things, but there are undercurrents that one can speak to in general.
Well, to answer Yang, the reason why labor is not reflective is the very same reason why parents struggle to apologize to their kids. It's a very painful exercise. But to get to my question, since Marikana, would you have thought that Cyril Ramaphosa would be president?
No, that's not.
And why? Yeah.
I mean, I think it just kind of points to the very weak pool of leadership to choose from. The fact that he was elected the president by the, I don't know how presidents get elected by the party. He was chosen by the party to lead them, despite what have been alleged. You know, they're trying to prove in court now something which is kind of hard to prove, some kind of collusion in that direct sense. To legally prove, you know, A plus B led to C. So there's sort of this loose chain of events of some phone calls and emails between Ramaphosa and the police. But then from the judge's perspective, it's like, he didn't tell them to shoot them, so he's not, you know, he's not guilty. So now, of course, I expected that, but we don't know. I mean, unless you would have had a different assertion. But yeah, I think what's also more infuriating is that not many people know about this. You know, people kind of see this Ramaphosa running on the promenade, I mean, social contacting, when like there's you know, this very real, brutal, recent history, which seems to be kind of swept under the carpet. But also just to elaborate on what Bernard said, is that within these legal approaches, yes, spaces do open up for interesting things to happen. So, for instance, the Marikana Commission went into this very deep legal debate about whether certain legal principles applied in the case of the police's use of force and the amount of force that was used. And so then there was debate in the commission, well, does this particular legal principle apply? It's an international legal principle. Does it apply in this context? And they found it did. And then essentially in a very obtuse kind of writing, the commission did find that the police were actually liable for the deaths because they had an ill-conceived plan which had led to the killing of the people. And so for that, based on that finding, again, the mine workers and their families can take, you know, can advance this in another court process. Because obviously what a commission finds is not a legally binding decision in any way. But of course it just reflects what's been termed lawfare, this kind of propensity in post-apartheid South Africa to move these political struggles into the courts to try and make sense of these very kind of social things which are very historically ingrained, which becomes difficult to do in a court.
Stephen, last question, but you're going to be brief as well, and then everyone will run what they want into their session.
Stephen already grilled me in my
No, this is great pieces. But I agree with these interventions. That is quite interesting. So, but I would say the law doesn't matter, but it matters. You know, that's same thing. Commissions don't matter. So, I'm interested from your critical legal sociology perspective, and it's in your thesis and you've spoken about. I mean, the law, from my understanding, requires arguments to go through the eye of the needle. So structural concerns cannot be channeled through the eye of the needle. So it's almost like there's a massive blind spot around structural concerns. So what, you know, the stories of the violence of extraction in South Africa and elsewhere is a long one that will never get into the courts. Or commissions, which usually have lawyers and trained scholars. So I suppose my question is, what does one expect from a commission that's framed in very specific ways to deal with gross human rights violations? And you've also written about it. It's a very technical legal term. So it's individual acts and have to have a political nature to them. It cannot be the mundane systemic structural violence, or what Mandela referred to, that was written out in when you had 1 day of institutional hearings for minors. So once one's seen what one's dealing with, that it's not going to address the structural issues, it's not able to, its brief isn't to deal with that, then how does one do critique of it? You note that it just doesn't go there. But so I'm just interested in, even the terms used, tragedy or massacre or crisis or, sorry, I'm really going to wind down very soon, but it's just so, and they're all events. They demarcated events. So it's not about the centuries of exploitation and violence of structural nature. So when does the law get to deal with that kind of stuff in the structure is really the question. And what does critical legal studies have to say about it?
So the idea that we're all equal under the law, rule of law versus rule of man, people, and so forth. And so I think the greatest example of a critical legal perspective to law is with this. It was advanced by Marx and in this piece on the law of theft of wood, where people who rely on picking up fallen wood from the ground to heat their homes, people who rely on wood to do that are particular people who don't maybe get it delivered to you or whatever, in your own forest, you kind of go and forage things on land. It only belong to particular group of people. And so if a law is passed that says it's illegal to scavenge wood from the ground, only certain people are being disadvantaged by that law, even though it's equally applied, it's not equally experienced. And so that's essentially what it is. Who are the people that suffer when there are laws that determine when it's appropriate to strike and so forth, or when it's appropriate? Only people who are really driven to strike, these kind of conditions have pushed them to that perspective, are going to be affected. I'm not probably going to be affected. We are not going to really be affected by those laws. And so it's really just critiquing the assumption that the law is this equal force. And that's the starting point for me. And also seeing law not as something in a silo separate to questions of politics or economy, and seeing the law as really constitutive of and part of the superstructure, to use those terms, but part of the relationship between the state, capital, and so forth. And it's kind of just using that as a lens, I suppose, to emissions. And just talked about another thing. What was it? There's another point I wanted to respond to. Oh, the structural things. Yeah, so again, this is another interesting thing with the Marikana Commission, because it sort of was very reflexive of the fact that it was another commission of mining sector violence in South Africa. And there's these, read the transcriptions if you all one day want to read the transcriptions of the commission. This first day, Parliament's like, if there ever was a commission in the history of South Africa that the world is looking at, it's this one. This is it. And so he was really reflexive that there couldn't just be another whitewash, that they had to kind of go beyond what had been the norm in South Africa. And so they actually devised this phase 2 of the commission, which was to look into the long-term, what they called sociological causes that had led to this massacre. And so they had these seminars that were held at Wits University over 3 days in different months, and people came and gave presentations, people from labor, people from academic sociologists came and said, presented their research and work with you and stuff, and came up with very convincing kind of causal evidence for why people would strike outside of reasonable, rational reasons, not why people would still be striking ununionized. One being the fact that a third of the workers were employed via labor brokers and actually weren't unionized. But even though there's this huge archive of information collected over those days, it actually doesn't feature at all in the report. It's almost like the commission people were like, I'm just going to move that aside and just like focus on what I understand with my sort of legal brain. So then you kind of get into these debates about, okay, well, maybe we should evaluate the process versus the product, or like the findings and the process of gathering these things and creating this archive is in itself this like intrinsically useful thing, which I think is in a way as well. But yeah, that's another thing that I'm trying to wrap in on. But the fact that it's able to sort of glimpse at and gather this information, but then cannot really digest it as a reason why this can happen. Why there was tension on the mind, why people were driven to protest after living in this squalid conditions. The work itself, the labor itself is like, we speak about it, like the hardest labor in the entire world. You're literally at the rock face with drills underground. I mean, it's great work. But yeah, it's just in terms of the eye of the needle is it's so precise, and so a lot of my work isn't really finding answers, just highlighting these contradictions.
Bernard had a passing comment.
Yes, I wanted to say there are many very revolutionary, inspiring teachers in this department, and we are transforming the curriculum. We see that in part or large part in the work that the students are doing. So I wanted to say that because also I noticed that some people have come in the break and joined this session, and I wanted to invite you. We've got two fabulous sessions, so please stay with us. Coming up now, one, gender, sexuality, and society in this room, the other on energy, infrastructure, and action, and 439. Please stay, get some coffee. There's hopefully some sweet stuff and pastries left, and then everybody's invited to dinner. I mean, some of that has been regulated, but I think that there's still space if people do want to come along. So, so please, thank you, Claire. Thank you to all of your energies, and let's continue.